A quiet California neighborhood, a military veteran bound to a wheelchair, two young immigrants with a knack for crime. But what happens when a brave young boy steps in and things take an unexpected turn, teaching everyone the true meaning of respect? Let's dive into a story of unlikely alliances, hard lessons, and the fight for dignity in a world full of differences. The late afternoon sun soaked the small town of Oak Ridge Hollow, casting long shadows and turning the sky a deep amber. If you were the kind of person who liked quiet, this was the place for you. If you wanted excitement, well, it was just a short drive to the next town over. Where people were likely still looking for something quiet, on his front porch, Jack Rollins was, as usual, tinkering with something. Today, it was an old clock radio that looked like it had been through a few wars. Jack had certainly seen his share of them. Vietnam, Afghanistan, and a few home repairs that went terribly wrong. Now, at 63, he didn't get around much without his wheelchair and prosthetic legs, but he didn't need to. There wasn't much Jack couldn't fix with a screwdriver and a little patience.
Well, come on, you old hunk of junk.
Jack muttered to the radio, poking at the guts of it with his screwdriver.
If I can survive all that, you can survive a little love and elbow grease.
The radio crackled, sputtered, and then nothing.
Figures.
Jack sighed, leaning back in his chair.
Guess I'll be having a date with the trash can later.
Across the street, there was a small lot behind Morales Mini Mart, a little family-run shop where locals gathered for everything from milk to gossip. The Morales family had been around Oak Ridge Hollow for as long as anyone could remember. The store was the anchor of the community, and while they weren't exactly the loudest people in town, they had a knack for making their presence known. As Jack sat on his porch, the usual suspects appeared by the mini-mart. Rico Morales, the youngest of the three cousins who ran the shop, and his two sidekicks, Diego and Luis. Rico had the kind of cocky swagger that made you think he'd been practicing it in front of a mirror since he was 12.
"Hey, Mr. Rollins,"
Rico called out, waving from across the street.
What's the deal? Is that thing going to work this time? Or you just building up character for next week's yard sale?
Jack raised an eyebrow and didn't bother to look up.
"It's a radio, Rico, not a yard sale item. It's supposed to play music, not take up space."
Rico snickered, walking over, his two cousins trailing behind.
"You really gonna sit here and fix that thing all day, huh? It must be nice to just sit around and not have to do anything."
Jack glanced up, finally making eye contact with the younger man. Rico was wearing that same half grin, a posture that said he thought he was the funniest guy in the room. Jack had dealt with his kind before, way back when he was stationed overseas. But back then, it was the enemy talking. Now, it was just some immigrant kid who thought too much of himself.
You're right, Rico.
Jack said slowly, adjusting himself in his chair.
No stress, no problems. Just a man, his chair, and his broken radio. What's better than that?
Rico's grin faltered a bit, but he didn't back down.
"Yeah, well, not all of us have the luxury of just sitting around, right?"
He gestured to the dusty lot behind the store.
"Some of us have to work."
Jack let out a dry laugh, a smirk tugging at his lips.
Oh, I get it. You think you're the only one who knows what hard work is, huh? Listen, kid, I've seen more dirt and sweat than you've had hot dinners. Work doesn't come with a badge or a hat. It's just a thing you do when you're too stubborn to quit.
Diego snickered, but Luis quickly elbowed him, sensing the tension rising. Rico shot a glance at his cousins before turning back to Jack.
"Yeah, well, you sure don't seem like you're out there breaking your back."
Breaking my back?
Jack said with a mock gasp.
The only thing that's been breaking is my spirit. Every time I try to fix this damn radio. And believe me, it's been more work than I thought.
The banter was interrupted by a familiar sound. the creak of the Morales family's back doors swinging open. Carmen Morales appeared, her hands on her hips and a sharp look on her face. Carmen was the oldest of the cousins and the one who usually ran the show, both at the mini-mart and at home. Her dark braids swayed behind her as she made her way across the street, ignoring the three young men for the moment.
Rico.
She called out, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Rico's face immediately dropped. He knew what was coming.
1 minute, come on, we're just talking to Jack here.
Talking, huh?
Carmen raised an eyebrow.
I'm pretty sure I heard you bothering the man while he's trying to enjoy his evening. Why don't you go back inside and unload the new shipment?
Rico opened his mouth to protest, but Carmen wasn't having any of it. She stood in front of him with that look, the one that said, "Don't test me today,"
Get to work.
she said firmly.
I'll let Papa know what you've been up to.
Rico grumbled something under his breath and started walking back to the store.
You know? You're no fun, Carmen.
You're welcome.
She called after him. Carmen turned to Jack, her expression softening slightly.
Sorry about him. He thinks he's funny.
Jack chuckled, waving her off.
Don't apologize, I've had worse. At least he hasn't thrown anything at me yet.
Carmen's lips curled into a smile.
Give it time. Anyway, if you need anything, batteries, a hand with your antiques, just holler. I'll bring over some dinner for you in that radio.
Jack grinned.
Only if you promise not to throw it at me.
I think I can manage.
Carmen said, turning back toward the store. As the sun dipped lower behind the hills, Jack relaxed in his chair, the quiet settling back over the street. The radio crackled weakly, but Jack didn't mind. Sometimes the noise was better than nothing.
Guess some things never change?
He muttered to himself, rolling his wheelchair back slightly. But for now, that was all right. Jack Rollins had learned long ago that not every battle needed to be won. Sometimes, the best part was just showing up for the fight. The morning sun was struggling to break through the blinds, casting a dull glow over Jack Rollins's living room. His coffee sat untouched, cooling quickly in his hands. He had been sitting like this for what felt like hours, his thoughts swirling with the memories of the phone call he'd gotten that morning. The deep voice of Charlie Moretti had triggered something in him, something he hadn't let surface in years.
Jack, it's Charlie from Nam.
The past came crashing back, friends lost, promises broken, and the gnawing emptiness of war that no one ever talks about. It was all a bit too much for him to handle before noon. The knock on his door startled him out of his thoughts.
Hell?
He muttered, setting his mug down. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he knew who it would be even before the door creaked open.
Hey, viejo.
Came the voice of Rico Morales, sharp and dripping with mock cheer. Rico had a way of strutting into a room like he owned the place, like he could shake off the weight of the world without so much as a glance at it.
What's up, kid?
Jack asked flatly, eyes not quite meeting his. He didn't have the energy for whatever mess this kid had cooked up today. Rico swaggered into the room, his worn-out sneakers barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. He was holding a small plastic bag, shaking it with an exaggerated flourish.
Traje algo.
He said, grinning, leaning in closer.
Brought you something.
Jack raised an eyebrow.
Don't need anything from you, Rico.
Oh, you want this?
Rico said, his voice stretching the vowels in a way that felt both playful and condescending. He pulled a small piece of metal out of the bag, dangling it in front of Jack's face like it was a rare artifact.
Prepáralo con festo.
He added, tossing the words out like he had all the answers.
Replacement part for your radio. The one you almost threw away yesterday like a damn fool.
Jack tensed, feeling the sting of Rico's words cut deeper than he expected.
You don't know anything about me.
Jack muttered, barely meeting the kid's eyes. He wanted to lash out, but he didn't have the energy for it.
Yes, of course.
Rico retorted, leaning in even closer. His accent thickened, drawing out the huss sounds as if to punctuate each insult.
I know exactly what you're about. You're just like everyone else around here, holding on to the past like it's the only thing you got left. But you're wrong, viejo. The world doesn't care about your dumb war stories or your stupid pride. It's moved on. You're still here, though, stuck in time, all alone.
He paused for effect, dragging the words out with a certain sharpness.
Or maybe you're just too proud to ask for help, huh?
Jack's hand clenched the armrest of his chair, the muscles in his jaw tightening. His voice came out sharp, but controlled.
You think you know everything, don't you? You don't know a damn thing about me.
Rico didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled the radio part out of the bag, holding it up to Jack's face like it was an offering.
Estoy aquí para ayudar, hombre.
Rico said, the words slow and deliberate.
I'm just here trying to help, but you're the one who can't see it. Go ahead, throw it away. Then you can complain when nobody gives a damn.
Before Jack could snap back, the sound of Carmen's voice broke the tension.
Rico.
She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Carmen was quieter than her brother, but when she spoke, she commanded attention. Her voice had a smooth cadence, with a slight Spanish rhythm to it that made her words feel warmer, more fluid, but just as sharp as her brother's.
¿Qué pasa ahora?
She asked, her tone measured but carrying a hint of concern, like she already knew the answer. Rico rolled his eyes and leaned back, throwing his hands up like he was the wronged party.
I'm just trying to help this guy out,
he said, his accent slipping into more English as his frustration grew.
But he's too damn proud. Doesn't want to admit when he's wrong.
He looked at Jack with a mock apology.
But hey, whatever. If you don't want it, fine by me.
Carmen's gaze never left Rico as she walked further into the room, her voice low.
Ya basta, Rico.
She said firmly, her accent sharpening on the R.
That's enough. You don't get to come in here, disrespect him, and pretend like it's helping.
Rico scoffed, clearly annoyed by his sister's interference.
He's just too proud to take a damn part for his radio. Whatever, I don't care. Let him wallow in his old man pride.
Carmen's eyes flashed with something fierce.
Idiot,
she muttered, stepping closer to Jack, her voice softening but still carrying that authority.
You don't need to listen to him. You're okay.
Her voice had a gentleness to it now, her accent heavy on the okay, almost like she was trying to calm the room. Jack felt the weight of her concern, but he pushed it down.
I'm fine,
he muttered, though his voice didn't sound convincing even to him. Carmen turned back to her brother.
Bernard.
She ordered, her tone final, almost as if she was done with him for the day.
Leave. Now.
Rico threw his hands up in defeat, looking from Carmen to Jack, his smile no longer as confident.
Fine, I'll leave the poor old man to his broken toys and bad moods, but don't say I didn't try.
He shot Jack one last potting look, half pity, half challenge, and turned to leave, muttering something in Spanish under his breath. Carmen watched him go, then turned back to Jack, her expression a mixture of frustration and concern.
Lo siento.
She said quietly.
I'm sorry about him.
Jack didn't answer immediately. His mind was still reeling from the conversation and the memories that had come rushing back with Charlie's call. The weight of it all felt like too much to bear at once.
I'll take the part,
Jack said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was still rough, but there was an acknowledgement in his words that he wasn't as solid as he wanted to appear. He reached for the piece of metal, his hand trembling slightly as he took it from the table. Carmen watched him, her face softening further.
You don't have to do everything on your own.
Jack didn't respond, only nodded slowly, staring at the radio again. The room was thick with the silence of unsaid things. The tension had settled, but something about it lingered, like an unspoken acknowledgement that the world around him was shifting faster than he could keep up with. Rico's words echoed in his mind, and the sting was still there, even as he tried to shove it all aside. Carmen sighed and placed a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder.
No tienes que está bien todo el tiempo.
She said softly, her voice full of empathy.
You don't always have to be fine, Jack.
Jack just nodded again, too exhausted to argue or explain. The house felt too quiet again, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't just the radio. It wasn't just the broken parts. It was the way everything had changed, how it felt like the town, his town, was becoming something he no longer recognized. That afternoon, Jack was sitting on his front porch, the air cool, despite the rising heat of the afternoon sun. He hadn't been in the mood to do much all day. Still tangled up in the thoughts of Charlie's call and the quiet stirrings of the memories from his time in Afghanistan. The part Rico had left for the radio was still sitting on the table by his chair, untouched. But as Jack adjusted himself in his seat, he noticed a movement across the picket fence. A boy, maybe 12 years old, was standing at the edge of the yard, peering through the slats. His face was a mixture of curiosity and something else, something almost wistful, like he was trying to figure something out but wasn't sure if he should get involved. Jack squinted.
"Hey, kid.
He called out, his voice rougher than he meant it to be.
What's up?"
The boy hesitated for a moment, then took a few steps forward, his sneakers squeaking against the dry grass.
I was just watching you and the guy, your neighbor, Rico, right?
Jack gave a slow nod, unsure of where this was going. He didn't have the energy to entertain any more of Rico's antics.
"Yeah, that's him. Why?"
The boy shifted uncomfortably, as if the question itself was awkward, and then finally spoke up.
I've seen him, he's always throwing stuff at you, making fun of you. He's been doing it for a while.
He paused, as though he wasn't sure if he should go further.
I don't think it's right.
Jack raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised.
"Well, I'm not exactly his biggest fan,"
he said dryly.
"but you seem like a smart kid. Guess you can see through it, huh?"
The boy nodded slowly, stepping a little closer to the fence.
Yeah, he's always been kinda, I don't know, rude.
He let out a half laugh, like he wasn't sure if it was okay to make fun of Rico.
Like, he talks like he's got a chip on his shoulder and a mouthful of insults.
Jack's lips twitched upward.
"Yeah, sounds about right. Welcome to the club, kid."
The boy hesitated again before speaking, his voice quieter this time.
My name's Gray.
He said, offering Jack a shy smile.
I've been around for a few years, but we never really talked.
Jack studied him for a moment, then nodded.
"Gray, huh? Sounds like a solid name."
He gave the boy a half smile.
"I'm Jack. You live next door?"
Yeah,
Gray said,
I just moved in about 6 months ago. Mom and Dad don't usually let me hang out with people. They're protective, but I've seen you a lot.
"Yeah, I'm not exactly hard to miss."
Jack replied dryly.
"Don't worry about the parents. They just don't get it."
He looked over at the street, his eyes distant.
"It's always easier when people don't bother you. That's what I've learned."
Gray didn't say anything at first, just watching Jack. And after a while, Jack felt like he was being studied, not in a rude way, but in a thoughtful way, like Gray was trying to piece together who he really was.
So,
Gray started, his voice a bit more tentative now.
how do you deal with it?
Jack let out a long breath, finally leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees.
"You don't, not really.
He stared at his legs, the prosthetics hidden beneath the faded jeans.
You just keep going because you don't have a choice. You learn to shut out the noise, the people who want to make you feel small, and you stop giving a damn about their opinions."
He let his words hang in the air for a moment.
The hard part, kid, is when it starts getting to you. And that's when you've got to find something or someone to keep you from sinking.
Gray stared at him for a long moment before speaking.
I think that's the hardest part, not letting it get to you.
"Yeah,
Jack muttered, almost to himself.
sometimes I wonder if it gets easier with time. You'd think after all these years."
His voice trailed off, his mind going back to the battlefield, the things that he'd tried so hard to forget. Gray wasn't quite sure how to respond to that, but after a long pause, he said,
Well, I think you're still a hero, Jack.
Jack gave him a soft smile, the first real one in a while.
"That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time, kid. You sure you're not trying to butter me up to skip out on the next basketball game?"
He asked with a grin. Gray laughed, shaking his head.
No, just speaking the truth.
"Well, you're smarter than half the people around here, that's for sure.
Jack chuckled, leaning back in his chair.
I've got my secrets, but I can't deny a good compliment."
Over the next few weeks, Jack and Gray started to talk more often. Gray would come over in the late afternoons after school, usually with a basketball tucked under his arm, ready to toss it around in Jack's yard. They'd sit together, shoot hoops, and chat about all sorts of things. Jack found the boys' presence oddly comforting, a reminder of simpler days before life got complicated. And for the first time in a long time, Jack found himself actually looking forward to someone's company. One afternoon, after a particularly good game of basketball, where Gray had somehow managed to beat Jack by a point, Gray sat down beside him, his expression more serious than usual.
You ever talk about what happened?
He asked carefully, his voice soft. Jack knew what Gray meant, but for a moment he was quiet. Then he sighed, staring at the ground.
You want to hear about Afghanistan?
Gray nodded slowly, his face full of curiosity and concern. Jack's eyes became distant as he began to speak.
I lost my legs there, kid. It wasn't one thing. It was a bunch of stuff happening at once. It was a mistake, really. One moment everything's fine, the next you're lying on the ground, and it's like your world is gone. I couldn't even feel it at first, but when I finally came to, I knew something was wrong. I tried to stand up, but my legs weren't there. That's the thing about war. It's not just the people you lose, it's the things you can't get back.
Gray said nothing. He just sat there, letting Jack's words settle in the space between them. Meanwhile, Rico had been keeping an eye on the growing friendship between Jack and Gray. He'd noticed the boy hanging around Jack's house more often. At first it bothered him, but as days went by, his irritation grew. The old man didn't need a kid in his corner, and if anyone was going to mess with Jack's pride, it might as well be him. One afternoon, as Jack was outside with Gray, shooting hoops again, Rico appeared on the other side of the fence, along with his friend Diego. They stood there for a while, watching the scene unfold. Jack and Gray were laughing over something trivial. Gray had made an insane shot that Jack had missed. And for a moment, it seemed like everything was fine, like Jack was normal. But Rico wasn't about to let that last.
Hey, Gray.
Rico called out, his voice loud enough to catch the boy's attention.
You really hanging out with this guy, the one who can barely stand up on his own?
Gray froze, the basketball falling to the ground with a soft thud. He turned to look at Jack, then back at Rico.
What's your problem?
Gray asked, his voice steady but edged with confusion.
Nothing.
Rico said with a twisted grin.
I just don't get it. That's all. Why are you wasting your time with him? You think he's going to teach you something, huh?
His voice was dripping with sarcasm, thick with that lilt of his. Jack stood tall, fists clenched, but he didn't speak. Gray, on the other hand, stepped forward, positioning himself between Jack and the two men across the fence.
You know what, Rico?
Gray said, his voice calm but sharp.
You've been running your mouth a lot, and I think it's time someone shut you up.
Rico raised an eyebrow, surprised.
What did you say, kid?
I said, you're acting like you're better than everyone, but you're not even from here.
Gray shot back.
You and Diego, you're the ones always acting like you own the place. But you wouldn't even be here if people like Jack hadn't fought for your right to be. So maybe you should show some respect for once instead of trying to tear people down.
Rico's grin faltered, his confidence wavering. He glanced at Diego, who was now shifting uncomfortably. Gray didn't back down.
I don't care if you think you're better than Jack because you can walk, but don't ever talk about him like that again. He's earned his place here. You're just passing through, like everyone else who came looking for something better. So next time you want to run your mouth, think about that.
There was a long pause. Rico's face reddened, but his bravado had started to crumble. Diego was looking at his feet now, clearly unsure of how to react. For a moment, the only sound was the breeze rustling through the trees. Rico finally muttered something under his breath, then spat on the ground.
Whatever, kid.
He grumbled, and with one last glare at Jack, he turned to walk away, Diego following reluctantly behind him. Gray watched them go, then turned back to Jack.
Don't let them get to you, okay?
Jack stood there staring after the two men. His eyes softened, and then a slow smile tugged at his lips.
Kid,
He said, shaking his head.
you've got away with words. You sure you're not just buttering me up so I don't make you run laps around here?
Gray smiled a little sheepish.
Nah, I'm just speaking the truth. You deserve better.
Jack gave him a long look, then patted him on the back. You've got guts, kid. I'm glad you're on my side. The tension lifted, and for the first time in a while, Jack felt like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. That evening, Gray sat at the dinner table, poking at his mashed potatoes. His parents had already expressed their pride when he mentioned standing up for Jack, but they didn't need to make a big fuss. They knew what mattered. Gray had done the right thing. That simple acknowledgement was enough for him. Across the fence, Carmen watched as Rico and Diego trudged over to her. She raised an eyebrow, arms crossed, already expecting some excuse.
So, ¿qué pasó?
She asked, her voice dripping with mock disbelief.
You two really let a kid talk to you like that?
Rico rubbed the back of his neck, clearly uncomfortable.
It wasn't like that, Carmen. The kid knows how to get under your skin.
Carmen snorted.
Seriously? You two, the tough guys, got schooled by a 12-year-old.
Diego shifted, clearly embarrassed.
Just wouldn't back down.
Carmen smirked, shaking her head.
Well, guess you learned something today. Maybe now you'll let the old man be.
Rico and Diego exchanged uncomfortable glances. There was no denying it. They'd been outplayed. From that day on, they avoided Gray and Jack, no longer taunting or bullying them. They kept their distance, carefully avoiding eye contact when they passed by. The street felt different, less charged, less hostile. Back at Jack's house, Gray sat across from the old man, both sipping coffee in a comfortable silence. Jack finally broke it, his voice serious.
Ray,
Jack said, his tone shifting.
you've been more of a friend than anyone else in a long time. And I've been thinking, I want you to have what I have left.
Gray blinked in surprise.
Jack, you don't have to.
Jack held up a hand, cutting him off.
It's not about what I have, it's about what you deserve. You've shown me something real. Take care of my things. Take care of yourself.
Gray was speechless, less convinced than ever that she was picking up the wrong person. Jack wasn't just talking about possessions. This was deeper. This was trust. Legacy.
You don't have to say anything.
Jack continued.
Just know I trust you.
Gray felt the weight of Jack's words, a sense of responsibility that settled over him like a heavy blanket. Jack wasn't giving him things, he was giving him a piece of his life, a piece of his heart, and that meant more than anything. As Gray left Jack's house that night, he knew things had changed. He wasn't just the kid next door anymore. He had earned respect. Rico and Dio knew it. From that day on, they kept their distance, no more taunts or jabs. It was clear they had learned their lesson the hard way. Carmen, meanwhile, was satisfied. She'd watched how quickly they backed off, and she couldn't help but smile. At least something good came out of all this, she thought with a self-satisfied grin.
Ya aprendieron la lección.
She repeated in English.
They have learned the lesson.
She wasn't angry with Gray, she was proud of him. It was about time someone put them in their place. As weeks passed in Oak Ridge Hollow, the newfound calm settled in like an old familiar quilt. Jack and Gray's unlikely friendship became the talk of the small town, though it was more whispered admiration than gossip. It wasn't just about a boy standing up to bullies or an old man finding companionship. It was about how their bond began to shift the neighborhood itself. The Morales family had always been respected, but Carmen's quiet authority gained new recognition after her decisive handling of Rico. The mini-mart became a hub, not just for groceries, but for conversation and connection. Carmen's calm demeanor and sharp wit made her a natural leader, and she used the newfound unity to foster a better environment for everyone. Rico, humbled and quieter now, took on more responsibility at the shop. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but he began to show glimmers of the potential Carmen always knew he had. Diego, following his cousin's lead, started to soften too, even offering an awkward wave to Jack whenever they crossed paths. Jack, reinvigorated by his connection with Gray, took on a new project. With Gray's help, he decided to restore the old radio completely, not just to play music, but to turn it into something special.
This thing's not just a radio.
Jack told Gray one afternoon as they worked on it together.
It's history. It's seen things, heard things. And maybe, just maybe, it can teach us something too.
Gray, fascinated by the process, started learning about circuits and wires under Jack's patient guidance. By the time the radio was fully restored, it wasn't just a working piece of equipment, it was a symbol of their partnership, of overcoming odds and finding purpose in unexpected places. Jack gave the finished radio to Gray, who placed it proudly on his nightstand.
Now you've got something to remind you.
Jack said with a grin.
That even broken things can come back stronger.
Gray's bravery didn't go unnoticed. Other kids in the neighborhood who'd been wary of Rico and Diego found their own courage to speak up and stand together. The younger Morales cousins, embarrassed but not hostile, began to integrate more into the fabric of the town, rather than standing apart from it. Even Jack, who'd spent years keeping to himself, found himself drawn into the community. People began to drop by his porch more often, some to chat, others to seek advice, or simply enjoy his dry humor. Carmen, true to her promise, occasionally brought over food or supplies, though she made sure never to treat Jack like he needed charity.
You've got more friends than you think, Jack.
Carmen teased one day, setting down a tray of tamales. Jack raised an eyebrow.
Didn't know I signed up for a fan club.
It's a fan club.
Carmen shot back with a smirk.
A community.
The real turning point came at the town's annual fall festival. Jack, for the first time in years, agreed to attend. Gray had convinced him, promising it would be worth it. With some effort, Jack navigated the grassy field in his wheelchair, Gray at his side. At the festival, Jack was met with warm smiles and greetings from people he hadn't spoken to in years. Carmen, now a de facto community leader, made sure to introduce him to everyone. Even Rico, more subdued but sincere, approached Jack with a handshake. Rico said, his voice quieter than usual.
Thanks for putting up with me.
Jack, never one for dramatics, gave a simple nod.
It takes guts to say that, kid. Keep it up.
The festival was a testament to how much the town had changed, and how much Jack and Gray had been at the center of that change. Months later, as winter settled over Oak Ridge Hollow, Jack Rollins and Gray Walker's friendship had become a cornerstone of both their lives. The chill in the air couldn't dampen their routines. Each afternoon, Gray would knock on Jack's door, basketball in hand, or sometimes carrying a book he thought Jack might find interesting. Jack would greet him with a sarcastic quip or a knowing grin, and they'd spend hours talking, tinkering, or shooting hoops in the driveway. Gray had become more than just a neighbor to Jack. He was family. For the boy, Jack wasn't just a mentor. He was a living example of resilience and kindness, even when life gave you every reason to shut the world out. And though Jack never said it aloud, he knew Gray had given him something he hadn't realized he was missing: purpose. Jack's home, once a quiet and solitary retreat, now hummed with life. Gray's laughter often spilled out into the street, a sound that made neighbors smile as they walked by. Carmen Morales, who had watched the transformation from afar, would sometimes join them, bringing over steaming cups of hot chocolate or a fresh plate of empanadas.
You've turned him into quite the socialite, Gray.
Carmen joked one frosty evening, watching the boys shuffle cards at Jack's kitchen table for one of their marathon games of gin rummy. Gray grinned.
I don't know about that. He still likes his peace and quiet.
Jack snorted. But he said it with a smirk, and everyone knew he didn't mean it. As much as things had changed for Jack, they had changed for the town too. The fallout of Gray's confrontation with Rico and Diego had rippled across Oak Ridge Hollow in unexpected ways. Rico, once cocky and quick to antagonize, had begun to mellow. He had started showing up to work early at Morales Mini Mart, taking pride in the family business for the first time in years. Diego followed suit, finding small ways to help out in the neighborhood, from shoveling snow for an elderly couple down the street to offering free sodas to kids who came into the store after school. Carmen, ever the steady anchor of her family, noticed the shift and quietly gave Gray credit for sparking it. She never said it outright. Rico's pride wouldn't allow it, but she knew that standing up to her brother had forced him to look in the mirror. The community took note too. What had once been a fractured neighborhood, divided by misunderstandings and grudges, began to feel whole again. One snowy afternoon, Jack and Gray were sitting on the porch, bundled up against the cold. Jack had insisted that the best kind of thinking happened outdoors, regardless of the weather. Jack began, his voice unusually reflective.
You ever wonder about the kind of mark you leave behind?
Gray glanced up from the snowball he was packing.
What do you mean?
I mean, when you're gone. What people will say about you. What they'll remember.
Gray thought for a moment.
I guess. I just want people to know I tried to do the right thing, that I stood up for what mattered.
Jack smiled, his breath fogging in the cold air.
Well, Kit, you're already doing that. More than most adults ever do.
The boy shrugged, a shy grin on his face.
I learned from the best.
Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he gazed out at the snow-covered street, the houses twinkling with Christmas lights. The faint strains of music floated through the air, Gray's radio, the one they had fixed together, playing softly from the boy's room.
You know,
Jack finally said, his voice tinged with emotion.
that radio, it's more than just a machine. It's a reminder that even when things seem broken, they can be fixed. It might take time, and it might not look or sound the same, but it can still work. It can still mean something.
Gray nodded, his expression thoughtful.
Like you, Jack.
The older man chuckled.
You're not wrong, kid. Not wrong at all.
As night fell, Gray returned home, the radio's warm melodies still trailing after him. He set it on his nightstand as always, the glowing dial casting a soft light across his room. To anyone else, it was just an old piece of equipment, something outdated and insignificant. But to Gray, it was a symbol of everything Jack had taught him: resilience, respect, and the power of human connection. Across the street, Jack sat by his window watching the lights in Gray's room flicker out. His house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. For the first time in years, Jack felt whole. Not because the pain of the past had vanished, but because someone had helped him carry it. The radio played on in Gray's room, its music a bridge between two lives that had once seemed worlds apart. It was a quiet reminder of their shared story, a testament to dignity, the courage to stand up for what's right, and the unlikely friendships that can heal even the deepest wounds. And in Oak Ridge Hollow, under the gentle blanket of snow, the neighborhood felt a little warmer, a little kinder, and a lot more connected, all thanks to a veteran, a boy, and the lessons they taught each other. If you were in Gray's shoes, would you have had the courage to stand up for someone like Jack, even if it meant facing people twice your size and older?